Right, good evening everybody and welcome to this evening's talk. I'm very pleased this evening that we're able to be joined by David Abrutat, who is the departmental historian for GCHQ's historical section. So good evening, David.
Hi, Simon.
Hi. Well, thanks very much for joining us this evening. Scarborough born and bred, I understand.
Yes, I have the fortune or misfortune of being a Scarboroughian by birth. Lived down south for nearly 30 years, but Scarborough will always be home.
Excellent. So obviously David's just about to start his talk, but one of the things is obviously, as per normal, if you want to ask David any questions about his talk, you can use the chat, which you should see on the screen to the your right, if you're watching on your computer, or alternatively email me on the feedback@sars.org.uk email address, and then what I'll do is I'll collate those questions for David at the end of the talk and put them to him. Just bear in mind that we're coming from you ever so slightly in the future, so make sure you get your questions in advance at the end so that we don't miss the opportunity to ask David any questions. So I think with that, that's enough from me, and over to yourself, David. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining me on this Monday night. Hopefully this will be a bit of a step change from the national news. I'm going to talk to you really about some of the interesting sites in Scarborough. We've entitled this Uncovering Scarborough's Secret Sites, lots of S's. But I'm going to probably try and not use a lot of terminology that we use in the signals intelligence world, or SIGINT world. SIGINT being essentially information gathered from the interception of signals, whether those are between people or electronic signals which aren't directly involved in communication. So I use terms like interception and potentially DF, or direction finding, throughout the talk. So apologies if I do get a bit techie. But it's a complex business. SIGINT really, and the interception of signals really goes back to way before the First World War. But bearing in mind the use of wireless technology, radio technology, was really starting to evolve in the latter part of the 19th century and early 20th, with pioneers like Marconi. And Scarborough, well, surprisingly for many people, was right at the forefront of this. And Scarborough has a genuine place in history, and one that I'm, as a Scarboroughian, I'm very proud of. And we've recently engaged with the Scarborough Archaeological and Historical Society on a little project, and it's really about this one particular site. Many of you who live in and around the town will know the site on Urton Moor, because it's been there since the Second World War. But there was a station, a wireless station, long before Urton Moor existed, and it was placed in a place called Sandybed Lane, just really round the corner from the site that's currently there. So Scarborough's got the oldest continually operated signals collection site in the world, and a chap called John Patrick, who many of you will know, one of the archivists, volunteer archivists down at the library, has been doing some work as part of the sort of investigations around this site, because you may be surprised to know GCHQ doesn't have a lot of historical artifacts and documentation around this original site, because it was owned by the Admiralty, it was owned by the Royal Navy, so it wasn't really ours. So the files and documents about the origins of this site are few and far between. But there's actually quite a bit of material in the Scarborough Library archive, and literally about 3 days ago, John found this particular extract from the Mercury, which was dated in March 1910. So the idea and concept of putting in an Admiralty station into Scarborough goes back to March 1910, long before the First World War began. But the site itself wasn't formally established until 1912. I think the Admiralty actually bought the land in 1911. but it wasn't really until 1914 when the site stopped being a communication site in terms of Royal Navy relays between shore to ship and ship to shore. It became an interception site, and the provenance of and the realization how important collecting signals were against the enemy. 1914 obviously being the year the First World War began, with trying to intercept communications from the German high seas fleet in the North Sea. So the image in the top right, that's actually an Ordnance Survey Map from 1926, which one of the Historical Society members found just before Christmas. And you can see the blue box, which is the area that actually has the footprint of the buildings in situ in 1926. And behind that, certainly to the southwest of the area, you can see sort of sequential dots, which will be the base plates for the aerials that were put in place. So the mainstay of the site was the station officer in charge house, or IC's house, which is called the Cottage, which is this building on the top left there. You can see with the aerials. I've recently acquired that particular image from eBay. I won't tell you how much I paid for it, but that house is still there. And I think it was 2014, GCHQ, along with the proprietor of the house, the then proprietor of the house, we installed a blue plaque to show how important that site was to British intelligence. And our friend John Patrick again, I don't know if he's on the call, but he found this very interesting photograph of the individuals who worked at the site in April 1914. The front chap there is Chief Officer Dean, who was the officer in charge at the time. And note there's a little terrier dog, a bit of a mongrel, who was affectionately known as Bob. And in December 1914, during the German bombardment of the town, he was so petrified because a number of shells landed quite close to the site. He scampered up to Jacob's Mount and had to be retrieved several hours later. So the complex in Sandybed was really the beginnings of a number of sites on the East Coast for interception, but also for direction finding, trying to triangulate where those German ships were in the North Sea to help guide the British fleet to intercept those German squadrons and to try and take them out. So a number of staff, wireless operators were recruited and put onto the site, and any what we call encrypted communications would go to a small crypt analytic bureau, code breaking bureau in the Admiralty in London, which was given the name Room 40 because that's the room they were located. And they started to develop and evolve a capability against German cipher systems, and had real strategic effect for understanding and getting forewarning of German squadrons coming across the North Sea to attack Britain. The whole site was surrounded by a very, very prominent steel fence, and the operators worked on the ground floor of this particular house, and as other buildings were put up, the site expanded. And I've just got a photograph here. You can see the original fence on the left, which is a photograph I took just before Christmas from a lady called Hilary Marshall, who lives on the site in a house that was built in the 1930s, and her house is surrounded by the original fence. It's a real piece of British workmanship, the fact that that fence is still standing over 100 years later. Fantastic. So in my best graphics, I've tried to sketch the perimeter of the fence that is still in situ on that Google map, so you can still see remnants of the perimeter fence that is still there. Most of it's hidden by hedge, but certainly the area around the cottage in the bottom right-hand corner. You can see the original gate, which is where personnel used to come in and out of the building. The only image I had up until about a year ago was that image in the bottom there, which was probably taken, I'm guessing, about 1946, because the prefab buildings in sandy beds are there, and they're all built, I think, post-war. But you can see the buildings at the back, and you can see some of the aerials to intercept high frequency or HF radio signals from the German fleet. Probably worth mentioning, post-war, the site didn't just work against the German Navy communications. They were also started to expand and started to intercept diplomatic communications, which again were using similar technologies, high frequency radio, which span the globe. And in March 1922, the Raincliffe estate was broken up and sold at auction, and lot 5 was purchased by the Crown and then acquired by the Admiralty, and which included an area of land, a pocket of land, which was owned by the Scarborough Racecourse. Lord Lounsborough, as many of you know, owned that area of land, gave his consent for it to be used as an encampment for soldiers, which were the first Lancashire Rifle Volunteers. And in 1932, the site was threatened with closure, and there was talk of moving the interception operations from Scarborough to a place called in Hampshire, but fortunately that decision was revoked. And around the mid-1930s, the British government was getting very energised by the Spanish Civil War, and began intercepting again German Navy communications, which were restarted really just in time for the build-up. And this was when we started to see German Enigma traffic going over the airwaves, because the German Condor Legion, which was deployed to Spain to help Franco's forces in the Civil War, was sent with 10 Enigma machines. We'd actually had our hands on real Enigma machines. We actually had physical access to them from 1926. But to actually see transmissions that have been encrypted using Enigma machines, it had to wait until much later. One of the most famous officer in charges was a chap called Lieutenant Commander Jock Roger, who took on the leadership of the site in January 1934. When he did, it was in a bit of a sorry state. He referred to it as a Cinderella site, and I quote, "The interception and electrical equipment could only be classed as junk, and my operators were of the opinion that the material read was destined for the waste paper basket." So world events around this mid to late 30s period was really starting to pick up pace. We've got Hitler's accession to power in Germany, the Japanese seizure of Manchuria, the Spanish Civil Wars just mentioned, Mussolini's Abyssinian conquest, really increased the need for signals intelligence, not just for the British government, but also for the armed forces. And really, Scarborough site was on a semi-war footing around this period, sort of mid-30s onwards. And significant infrastructure was beginning to be put in place around Scarborough. And a lot of the equipment in sandy bed was upgraded, and to meet the increasing demands from the sites, and new aerials were erected. He would lead, Roger, would lead the site for 10 years, and one of the longest serving commanding officers. And he played quite a fundamental role in a national level direction finding network for the Admiralty, which was going to put us in really good standing during the Second World War. So this is one of the most quaint photographs we've got of Bletchley Park. The Bletchley Park story is obviously endemic to the story of British signals intelligence. Hollywood films, dozens of books have been written about Bletchley. But Britain was very much preparing for war from 1938, the Munich crisis. And in August 1939, the Government Code and Cipher School, which became GCHQ, were moved in to Bletchley. And roughly about 180 staff at that stage, and very much a small code breaking or cryptanalysis unit. The reliance to do the actual interception and direction finding lay in the Y services and a number of other organisations like the Post Office, the Radio Security Service, etc. But the military sites, the Army, RAF and Royal Navy were fundamental to intercepting the communications from the Axis nations during the whole Second World War. So sites like Scarborough were doing that interception phase. They were pulling in signals and doing the traffic analysis locally in Scarborough, and any of the encrypted or encoded communications were then distributed back to Bletchley, who could then work on those enciphered communications to try and understand what they were and how important they were. And it led to the reshaping of GC&CS and the industrialization process behind signals intelligence, which is still important to this day. The likes of Alan Turing, Gordon Welshman, John Tiltman, Bill Tutt, huge legends of our time who have changed the world in the things that they have done. Bletchley helped shape the development of computing, for example, one thing that we all have sought benefit from. So going back, Scarborough was very much at the forefront of the collection of German naval and naval air communications throughout the Second World War. And you may be not surprised to know that Scarborough was also home to a small RAF SIGINT component as well, again based at Sandybed, but we also had a DF site, a high frequency direction finding site on the Castle Headland, and this is again only recently I found this image on some of the historic England post-war imagery. Very, very typical of its time. You can see the image on the left, a wooden hut, which is the iconic direction finding hut you'll see in other sites all over Britain. So this, the footprint for this site is still there as well. There's an awful lot of archaeology on the Castle Headland, as everybody knows. So I'm now going to talk you through some of the stories of the site during the Second World War, and then touch on a few post-war as well. Scarborough played an important part in the sinking of the German battleship, the Bismarck, in May 1941. It was the key aspect was helping with the location and so on. One Royal Navy intercept operator who worked on it was a chap called Raymond Whitaker. He intercepted the final message from Admiral Lutyens on board, who was the commanding officer of the Bismarck. He was transmitting a signal to German naval headquarters in Paris on the 25th of May 1941. The DF control in Scarborough was able to plot the target. Subsequently, a Catalina flying boat from the Royal Navy was sent out to locate the Bismarck, which was subsequently found and then sunk on the 27th of May 1941. Now, Scarborough wasn't exclusive in that regard. There were a number of other sites who helped with getting that locational fix, and Bletchley was also part of that whole jigsaw puzzle. Very much signals intelligence is a jigsaw puzzle. But the importance of this sinking was the fact that it was for the first time really at Bletchley Park that they felt they made a contribution to the war effort. Although it was definitely more traffic analysis than cryptanalysis, it was an important moment in time in that early stage of the Second World War, and really an important thing for national morale. Another interesting story that came out of the Second World War was the sinking of this boat, this sinking of the SS Aguila. This was in August 1941. An armed merchant vessel, the SS Aguila, was loaded in Liverpool with cargo and a large number of Royal Navy personnel and civilian passengers, all bound for Gibraltar and then onward to Singapore. Included in the group of 21 Women's Royal Navy Service, or WRENs, 12 of that group had been based in Scarborough. You can see quite a haunting picture of all 12 of those WRENs in Scarborough, and the image on the left. The Aguila was one of 23 merchant ships that formed convoy OG 71, which left Liverpool on the 13th of August. On the 17th of August, German aircraft spotted the convoy, and the next day, a German U-boat Wolfpack intercepted the convoy. And at 03:10 AM on the 19th of August, U-boat U-201 fired 2 torpedoes into the vessel, and it sank with almost all hands. As a result, the Royal Navy stopped using civilian ships to carry personnel from then on. And the press, there was a huge press outcry as a result of the sinking, and really focused on the loss of the 21 WRENs. And the other WRENs around the country donated a day's pay to build a memorial fund for the families. And a lot of that money went to the RNLI, who helped fund a new lifeboat. And in 1951, this lifeboat was given the name the Aguila WREN in their honour. And it was launched in Aberystwyth on the 28th of June, 1951. And it served until 1964, until it was relocated to Redcar, where it saw service until 1972. This lifeboat was called out 74 times, the lives of 38 people, and I don't think you could get a better legacy. The ladies from Scarborough were memorialised with a memorial bench that is still in situ by the lighthouse on the pier, and every 2 years the Women's Royal Navy Service and the Royal British Legion have a little ceremony on the 19th of August. Quite an emotive thing. I've managed to track down the SS Aguila, so the actual, not the SS Aguila, the Aguila WREN lifeboat. It was in a very, very bad state of repair, but the son of a chap that works at the Redcar RNLI station bought it, and it is now in a boatyard in Northern Ireland and being completely restored. And in the future, probably in the next 1 to 2 years, I would love it to come to Scarborough, and so watch that space, because it'd be a really nice thing for us to do. So the WRENs in Scarborough were an important group. A lot of the day-to-day watch operations at the sites were orchestrated by the WRENs, and they worked long hours in very, very challenging conditions. It's probably also worth mentioning just down the road in Snainton, there was a contingency site built for Urton Moor when that came online, in case it was ever attacked by German bombers. It was originally a group of, or complex of old wooden huts, but it also became a bit of a training facility, and personnel from as far afield as Poland, Canada and America were trained there in wireless operations. So Urton Moor I've mentioned a few times. This is one of the earliest photographs we have of the site, which was taken in 1947, just after the war. It was actually in early 42 that a new interception station at Scarborough was sanctioned, and construction began. And it was Marconi who did the design and install of the aerial arrays. The original costs were £52,000, which is equivalent to about £2 million today. On the 1st of March 1943, the intercept station moved from Sandybed Lane to Urton Moor. And this happened in the middle of one of the shifts. And what was remarkable was the transfer occurred without any stoppage of any of the interception cover or the passing of any traffic to Bletchley. The commanding officer at the time commented, "This was a feat of organised planning." What an understatement. So at the end of the war, the Cold War, the station started to change tack and started to focus a lot more on the Soviet armed forces communications. And Scarborough, with all the knowledge and expertise that it developed during the Second World War and before that, started to take ownership of the interception of Russian naval high command traffic and naval merchant traffic of the Warsaw Pact. A new building was constructed on the site, which was completed in 1955. And certainly one of the most famous stories in that Cold War period is that of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Really one of the few stories of the Cold War that can't emphasize more the importance of the bilateral partnership with America more, but also maybe with what's going on in the world today, something around Russian aggression. The US President John F. Kennedy was told on the 16th of October that the Soviet Union was shipping medium-range ballistic missiles onto Cuban soil in range of the southern US states, including Florida. And Kennedy, his strategy was to opt for a naval blockade, which was announced on the evening of the 22nd of October. And some Soviet merchant vessels were already en route to the island. And the biggest question at the time was whether they would break through the blockade. And I'm sure many of you, when you think of the Cuban Missile Crisis, you think of those wonderful, iconic aerial reconnaissance images from the U-2 spy planes, showing all those fixed missile silos on Cuban soil. But Scarborough had an important part to play in the story, and it was around this ship, the Kislovodsk, on the 24th of October 1962. Sometimes signals intelligence work is about being in the right place at the right time. And as I mentioned, one of the main tasks of the site at the time was to monitor Soviet merchant shipping. A very, very mundane, monotonous task, monitoring ships coming across the North Atlantic. But they developed the target knowledge and expertise on this particular target set. And in October 1962, it came right to the prominence because of the threat of World War III breaking out. So Scarborough had been intercepting transmissions from this one ship and noted its position northeast of where it had been just 12 hours before, and pushed out a SIGINT report, and it confirmed it had discontinued its voyage and had turned back towards the Baltic. The next day, further SIGINT reports showed more ships originally bound for Cuba had altered their course and were returning to Soviet ports. And this is the actual report you can see before you. In the early hours of that day, that report got to an American NSA analyst, one of our counterparts, a lady called Juanita Moody, who wanted to make a call direct to a chap called Adlai Stevenson, who was the then US ambassador to the UN, because he was making an address to the UN Security Council the next day. State Department officials refused the call, so she dialed the number for his hotel room, getting him out of bed. Essentially, this report provided the first signs that the nuclear standoff was beginning to abate, and essentially Khrushchev was standing down. The report also hit the desk of the White House Situation Room in Washington. In 1965, the site, because of what was going on around the country, a variety of civilian interception sites were being unified and being subordinate into different ministries, and GCHQ coordinated this whole process, and all of the interception sites became known as CSOs, Composite Signals Organisation. So Urton Moor became CSOS, which the last S being station, Urton Moor. And certainly when I was a child of the 70s, I remember CSO on the road signs. So the work on the current buildings, which are still in situ today, started in 1972, and you've got these photographs showing some of the construction underway. The new building opened 2 years later. And as the Cold War ran on, the fall of the Iron Curtain and demise of the Soviet Union resulted in a significant reduction in the UK's signals interception. So a lot of sites were closed, and missions from other stations like Cheadle and Culm Head were transferred to Scarborough in 1995, 1998, respectively. In July 2001, the site was officially avowed and renamed GCHQ Scarborough. And we do get the odd famous visitor now and again. 30th of July 2014, so the date of the site's centenary, the Prince of Wales visited the site, arrived via helicopter, as one does, and toured the site and its museum, and got to fiddle with an enigma, met lots of members of staff, and unveiled the commemorative plaque you can see before you. It was alleged to be the first official royal visit to the site, although it has been rumoured that George VI paid a surprise visit to boost morale during the Second World War. So that's probably all I wanted to talk about tonight. I'm very interested in taking any questions, but if you are interested in reading a bit more about our history, there's a book that was published as part of our centenary work by Professor John Ferris, who's a Canadian academic, called Behind the Enigma. It's our first ever commissioned authorised history. Really, really good insights into some of the stories I've taught you through tonight, but many, many others. And also, if you're based in Scarborough, please do go down to the Scarborough Library, because we've just relocated the exhibition that we've got on, and it's free to enter. And you should be able to buy a short history of GCHQ Scarborough, which I wrote last year, and the proceeds of that go to some of the Urton Moor charities. And if you're interested in travelling further afield, early in February, on the 11th of February, we opened the latest and last round of our Science Museum exhibitions, which is at the National Science and Media Museum in Bradford, and it will run there until the 5th of June. Again, it's free to enter, and it's a real showcase of GCHQ history. It's a fabulous exhibition. Just to give you some insights, when we had it in London, there were over 206,000 visitors during the months it was there. It then moved up to Manchester. So this next phase is certainly the closest to Scarborough. So if you are interested, please do go. So yeah, I'm open to any questions.
Oh, well, thank you, David. With being the society's computer geek, as I've been referred to, there's obviously a lot in there for me to take. Well, one of the things I was just interested in was certainly from the early days is the geographical location of the site significant, and does that sort of waned somewhat with advances in technology, and now the sort of a position of it is a legacy of sort of its original sort of positioning?
Yep, positioning for the interception sites is very much dictated by the quality of the atmospheric, so the HF propagation, as we call it. So there's sort of two forms of high frequency radio, how HF radio can communicate around the world, and essentially you've got the ground wave, which is sort of the hops around the more or less ground level, and the bounces off the ionosphere. And if you're in the right place, you can collect signals from all over the world. And it's interesting that Sandybed Lane's in a bit of a dip. So you've got the Fallsgrave Park, and then you've got a bit of a dip, and then you've got Jacob's Mount. So it's actually in a bit of a dip, which seems quite a strange place to put a signals interception site. But it was put there for a reason. Yes, because of the land, but because it was also the right place to collect signals. Lots of tests would have been done to locate the site at the right place, and certainly Burton Moor would have been bought for exactly the same reason. And certainly there's some of the conversations I've had with the Historical Society Committee about whether the bombardment in 1914 was a direct target for, they were actually trying to hit the wireless station in Sandybed, because a number of the artillery, or the rounds and the ships did hit very, very close. So yeah, it'd be interesting to know what the ground truth is. I think there's been various historians and academics have done as much research as can be done. We probably never know.
Yeah, because we had was it the visit in 1913 of a group of German doctors at the things that aroused some sort of suspicion and various theories about what the purpose of their visit was, wasn't it? I think.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
And just going back to almost right at the start, you're talking about Ring 40, because I mean we're all familiar with the sort of the decryption that Bletchley did in the Second World War. How successful was the Ring 40 at the decryption thing? Obviously, were we sort of able to understand German communications through the work they did?
Maybe I'll talk a bit about the prehistory of GCHQ. So I mentioned Government Code and Cipher School, GC&CS. So that was formed officially in the 1st of November 1919. So that was formed after the First World War. I think there was a realization how important this decryption work was to the nation. So they wanted an organization in peacetime. But during the First World War, there was two independent sort of code-breaking entities. One that was owned by the War Office, which was MI1B, and one that was in the Admiralty, which was Room 40. And both had remarkable successes against German naval and army ciphers in their reciprocal targets. And a classic example of Room 40's success was the Zimmermann telegram in January 1917. A fabulous story. Nigel de Grey, one of the cryptanalysts of legend, he was working at Room 40 and was passed a telegram, an enciphered telegram that had been transmitted by Arthur Zimmermann, who was the German foreign minister at the time, proposing an alliance with Mexico. Essentially, he was giving them authority to invade America, to try and bring them in, to distract them, because the Germans wanted to carry out unrestricted submarine warfare in the North Atlantic to sink convoys. And if they did that, they might sink an American ship, which might bring them into the war. The Zimmermann telegram brought the Americans into the war because the information, the decrypted intelligence from that telegram was given to the Americans. And in April 1917, the Americans joined the First World War. And many people think it was the sinking of the Lusitania which brought the Americans into the war. It wasn't. It was the Zimmermann telegram. So there's an argument whether it was the most important piece of signals intelligence ever, because there's obviously been a lot. But the outcome of that one particular piece of decryption, was changed the course of the First World War.
And the Bismarck, the last transmission from the Bismarck, there was a correction on that. Was that as per the transmission, or was the correction from the transmission from so was that did the Germans make the mistake?
Yes, I think it was the Germans made the mistake, and it's been transliterated into the English.
Right, and so they actually put the 4 crosses in to say, rather than lat cross and then the last or whatever like that. And that was actually, so they actually encrypted an incorrect message and things. Yeah, is that the nature of the encryption? Is that they have to key it and then reverse what they do? Is it sort of?
Yep.
Yeah,
that's right. Yep.
All right.
Two-way process.
And then did Bletchley, again, it's more a sort of general question, Bletchley is obviously heavily involved in the decryption. Does Bletchley contribute to the British encryption that it was using? Did they feed back so they say, oh, they identified the vulnerabilities, and so this is what should contribute to our encryption methods and things?
That's a very good question. Communication security has always been part of our organisation's remit. But when the organisation moved into Bletchley Park, there was a small splinter group which moved into a place called Mansfield College in Oxford and set up essentially a cipher production unit, which were responsible for creating one-time pads, code books, etc., for all military arms and the government. Largely because Mansfield College, Oxford, you're right close to the Oxford University Press, which was requisitioned during the war to do purely printing production for government departments and the intelligence services. So, and the sort of devices that we built and commissioned, for example, the Typex, which was sort of the British equivalent of the Enigma, wasn't really developed in the 1930s by GC&CS, but we were very, very involved in helping it come to fruition. It was actually developed by an RAF signals unit in London, and that Typex was never broken by the Germans, and it was used throughout the war by the British and to a degree the Allies, and then it was used actually after the war as well. So very much communication security has been part of our remit, and it has been up until the modern day. We've now got the National Cyber Security Centre, which was formed in 2016, and it's really been the template by which governments all over the world have really used that as a template to have a centre of excellence for cybersecurity in terms of defence.
Right.
So,
And so in Scarborough, and then going to the actual sort of the Scarborough was responsible for forwarding on collected transmissions, obviously, but wasn't involved in the decryption of so they would have no knowledge of the actual value of the information that they were passing on, would they? Or would they sort of like somehow pre-filter it, but saying that the source of this could be of interest? Is there, or is it just they transmit everything on en masse for analysis by Bletchley?
Yeah, the vast majority, was done by Bletchley. It was very, very, very rare it was done anywhere else because it was the centre of excellence in terms of the processing power. Obviously, they were building electromechanical machines to, speed up the processes, and the brain power of all these, specialists were at Bletchley, and it was their mandate. So if it was done anywhere else, people used to get upset. But there were other parts of the world where they had essentially Bletchley enclaves, places like the Middle East and the Far East. So the Far East Combined Bureau, for example, shifted around between Singapore, Colombo, and East Africa. There was a place called the Wireless Experimental Centre in New Delhi, which had thousands of staff. And again, it was a sort of a local version of Bletchley Park, which employed Indians, West Africans, and it was a global war, and subsequently everything was done almost on a regional level. But Scarborough also, as I've mentioned it a few times, was responsible for traffic analysis. So stepping away from decryption, traffic analysis is a very important discipline. Looking at the sort of message, we call it preambles. You got a person calling another person, the time, date, hellos, goodbyes, all the sort of peripheral stuff away from the content, which is often invaluable. And that was done at all the sites by specialists.
And that they were able to determine the location of the transmission, whether that would obviously be a massively significant component of what they're actually doing. And then are they encrypting on data then to pass on as well? So would Scarborough be involved in the encryption of data to pass on to Bletchley, which would then have to be, because if the Germans were aware that they were retransmitting things, or is that not part of what?
The direction finding is often helps augment other parts of the disciplines in terms of encryption or traffic analysis, but sometimes it might be the only source of intelligence on the ship's position. You might not be able to break out the content, but the fact you've got a triangulation on a location of where that vessel is with other sites on the East Coast, it can be as invaluable. So you can send a British naval squadron to go and intercept, and it's an important area of Scarborough's remit, and always has been right the way through to the First World War. A number of those sites around the East Coast were not just interception sites, they were direction finding sites as well. So it was like a direction finding network. Literally within seconds, multiple sites would be firing signals to try and triangulate, where that transmission's come from. Very, very effectively as well. So, it was certainly a game changer during the First World War and the Second World War.
That's great. Now, in the absence of any further questions, all that remains me to do, and one thing I will be cheeky about, is David was very kindly to plug his book. I think we should also plug Stuart's book, for those of you who haven't read it already. I know a good number of members have got the Scarborough War by Stuart MacDonald, so available from the Maritime Heritage Centre, Mrs. Lofthouse's, or online. So a plug for the Society's own publication there. But all that remains for me to do now is to thank you, David. Thank you very much for your time this evening. It's been really interesting. We look forward to working with you on the Sandybed project, and hopefully we'll be able to have you back again in the future to talk about that in the future going forward.
That's great, Simon. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you, everybody. In 2 weeks' time, we've got Paula Ware, who's going to be talking to us about the findings up at, which is caused national interest, the findings up at Eastfield and Middle Deepdale. So hopefully you can all join us again then in 2 weeks' time. So thank you very much, everybody.